This is episode 347 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is brought to you by our patrons. You can sign up to support the work we do here and get insider extras when you join us on Patreon. Sign up right now at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife.
Hi, I'm Dr. Alicia Andrzejewski. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
And you would add hot and dry herbs to it, and it would be medicinal, and it would help you in that way.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Mead has been made since ancient times and is the poster drink for historical gatherings, often being carried around in a large flagon or a mug of mead is a phrase that you're probably familiar with. You may also know already that mead is an alcoholic beverage, but you may be surprised to know how it's different from other alcoholic beverages, particularly in the 16th century. If you look up mead today, it's known as a honey wine and can be mixed with a variety of herbs and spices. And as the recipes describe it, mead starts to sound more like a beer than a wine. And since wine is made from grapes, not honey, you may be confused about what makes a honey wine like mead. To learn more about what makes mead a mead and how that's different from other brewed, distilled, or fermented beverages like Malmsey, Metheglin, or even aqua vitae, which are also mentioned in Shakespeare's plays, we're delighted to welcome our guest and expert in the history of mead, Laura Angotti. Laura Angotti has been researching and making mead for over 30 years, focusing on its early history and the specifics of how it was made and what it may have tasted like hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Trained as an engineer and biologist at MIT and Northeastern University, she worked in areas including industrial fermentation and water treatment before becoming a mead historian, where her scientific background serves her well. Laura writes about her work at mysteryofmead.com and Mystery of Mead on Facebook. Her books are available on Amazon, including Golden Sweet Ensnaring Mead in Great Britain, Prehistory to Elizabeth I, and Welcome Mead, 105 mead recipes from 17th and 18th century English receipt books. A list of Laura's works on mead, as well as direct links to her website, are available in the show notes for today's episode. Before we dive into our conversation with Laura today, I want to let you know that there is visual history that coordinates with our conversation today, including copies of some of the recipes mentioned, along with pictures of the fruits and herbs and spices that we're talking about go into mead. And all of these visual extras are packed into what's called the detailed show notes. On our regular show notes page for every episode here at That Shakespeare Life, we have a link to our Patreon page. You can use that button to log in if you're already a supporter, or you can join us right there if you'd like to sign up now, and the extras for the episode will expand right on the page. Again, that URL for this week is CassidyCash.com/episode 347, CassidyCash.com/EP347. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Laura. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Good to be here.
What are the main ingredients used to make mead? Were there any standard components? And as a fermented beverage, how does mead compare to beer?
So, like all my answers, this is probably going to be relatively involved because it's never easy. It's always complex and takes some context. So, mead is in the simplest group of fermented drinks. This includes mead, wine, cider, and even things like fruit wine and stuff made from fermented birch sap. Sugar is already present as sugar, so those microorganisms can go in, chew it up, make energy, and get rid of that alcohol and CO2 that they don't want, but we do. So all you need to make mead is honey and water. The microorganisms are present all around us every day, and it will, even if you leave it open, hopefully, maybe, eventually make mead. So the second type of drinks we have is where there's sugar present, but it's tied up in more complex things, carbohydrates. In this case, not only does your source have to be worked through like malting barley to make beer, but then that sugar has to be extracted from its original form. And this is usually done with enzymes, and it can be a process that's very fiddly. It requires specific knowledge and equipment. And don't think that makes it immensely hard. People have been doing it for thousands of years, including ways of taking a known quantity of grain and known quantity of water, throwing in rocks that have been heated over a fire, and that creates the correct environment. So the third type of drinks, which builds on the first two, is distilled drinks. These start with something that already has alcohol in it and concentrate it. Interestingly enough, this can be either done with heat or with cold, but most often is done with heat, taking advantage of the fact that alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water. So you hit a point where it's at just the right temperature where that vapor coming off is concentrated in alcohol. And then we condense that and turn it into all of our distilled drinks. This requires, again, special equipment and also special knowledge, because when it's done wrong, it can concentrate things that are poisonous, which we really don't like to drink.
No, I wouldn't think so. That's not the tasty part that we like.
So today we're used to all of these being readily available. But which ones were used, available, and drunk historically is dependent on this huge web of things: economics, politics, social pressures. What's the agriculture producing in the area? And that's where it gets really interesting. So I hold that mead is the most versatile fermented drink out there. Why? Honey, which we start with, is about 80% sugar. So that means when we dilute it before we ferment it, we can start with something that's very sweet or not so sweet. That affects both the amount of alcohol and whether you have a lot or a little of sugar left in it when you're done. Is it sweet or dry? When we look at all the things that have been added to mead historically, and I look up to period start ending at about 1750. And in that time period, the recipes I've cataloged, which is moving in on 5,000 now, includes over 50 different fruits added, over 50 different flours, pretty much every spice you've ever heard of, and over 300 different herbs, roots, barks, whatever. It also includes some things that sound a little less expected: chocolate, salt, milk, my favorite, ambergris, which is a production of a sperm whale's digestive system.
And most often used in perfumes, right? I mean,
yes, it was. And we see a number of mead ingredients that were well known in perfumery. Ambergris, musk, which is from the scent gland of a certain species of deer; ligny aloes, which is produced from a bacterial infection of a pine tree; another one, and things like myrrh,
which is a funeral spice. So those are, and very, for perfuming, because that's a stinky process. But that's so surprising, because you mentioned every herb I've heard of, and my mind immediately went to, well, what about the savory herbs? Because I think about mead being a sweet beverage, and I guess because it's based on honey, I think it's going to be like a dessert type flavor. But a lot of the herbs that you're mentioning would have created a savory taste to mead. So were there options to make it savory as well?
Absolutely. And this also goes to the differentiation between a difference in how they perceive sweet and savory in earlier foods, where cinnamon and onions and apples is a really tasty dish. So we see in mead, I've made a recipe from about 1660, which is rosemary and lemon. And with the sweet honey, it's an amazingly good mead. One of the early medieval meads we make is from Germany, about 1350, and it uses hops and sage. and is absolutely delicious. There's other ones that are a little bit more mind-boggling. I did make 3 versions because I had to test the options of the mid-17th century English horseradish mead.
Oh, that sounds formidable. What did that
It
taste
wasn't
like?
as bad as I expected, but I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be making it again.
So it doesn't go on the top 5 favorite mead list.
Nowhere near.
Well, now you mentioned that making beer requires a lot of specialty equipment, but what about mead? Where if we were wanting to set up our kitchen to create mead, what would we expect to need in terms of equipment?
Really, about the minimum you need is a container which you can close and get very clean, because when we make fermented drinks, alcoholic drinks, we're trying to create an environment with plenty of food where microorganisms want to grow. The backside of this is there's millions of microorganisms out of there, and most of them we don't want growing in something we're going to drink. So cleanliness or sanitization is pretty important. So when I first started making mead, I took a 1-gallon glass apple juice jug, cleaned it out really well, poured in a bunch of water, poured in a bunch of honey, mixed it up, added some yeast, put on what's called an airlock, which basically lets that CO2 gas out so you don't explode. Exploding things is pretty bad.
Especially exploding glass. That wouldn't have been
Exploding
profitable.
glass, yep, and doesn't let anything back in, and you let it go for a while. Now, if you're looking for more surety in your results, reproducibility in your results, or like many people today, you like to play with all sorts of different things, it can get infinitely complicated from there. But as its core, it's very straightforward.
Mead is also the name for a meadow, which I learned researching today's episode. But in my admittedly limited searching through Shakespeare's plays, I was only able to find the word mead used to describe meadows, the field of grass or flowers. And there doesn't seem to ever be a reference in Shakespeare's plays to a drink called mead. And that surprised me, since Shakespeare does talk about other fermented beverages like beer or malmsey. He even mentions aquavitae, which is the old phrase for whiskey, and even the word Metheglin gets used, which I believe is a kind of mead. But Laura, was mead, the word and the drink, I guess, an antiquated idea by Shakespeare's lifetime? Or am we just hanging too much on Shakespeare's plays here to think that if mead was popular in this time period, it would have been mentioned in his works?
No, mead absolutely was not antiquated in Shakespeare's time. In fact, it was undergoing a resurgence in popularity across the 16th and into the 17th century. So let's first talk about the meadows. Mead as a meadow, mead as a drink. As far as I can tell, they have 2 completely different etymological genealogies or histories. Chance makes it really a pain for me when I'm looking through old documents and want to look for mead, and all I can get is meadows. But that's my problem. So again, we're going to give a little bit of context to build up to it. The earliest known alcoholic drink was produced about 9,000 years ago in China. We have physical evidence on pottery shards from that time that points towards a drink that was made with honey, some fruits, and some grains. So mead is consistently seen among fermented drinks from then on to the common days. It's always there. But what drinks were most common and most drunk in any cultures, mead doesn't often make the top 2 or 3. We see wine, some version of beer, and often another drink, maybe cider, which was also very popular in 17th century England. So mead is this sort of undercurrent that carries through history, including Shakespeare's time. So the popularity of these drinks is always based on some of the things I talked about before. We have culture, we have economics, we have what's the agriculture like, what's available. And this is all going to be tied up in history and all sorts of other things. So we see mead, again, in the context of England, having a very high status from the earliest times. If we look back to the epic English poetry of Beowulf and Y Gododdin, We see mead mentioned more often than any other drink and with very high regard. This tells us that mead was known. Yes. Was it available? Yes. Was it popular? In fact, quite a bit less so.
One type of mead that I was able to find in Shakespeare's works was known as Metheglin, and it comes up once in Love's Labour's Lost and again in Merry Wives of Windsor, both times being in a list alongside other drinks like Malmsey. And in the case of Merry Wives of Windsor, it's listed alongside specific vices and things that would get you into trouble, like swearings and the phrase pribbles and prabbles, which means petty arguments. Laura, I had thought Metheglin was a medicine specifically. And in fact, when I look through the 16th century recipes you shared in your manuscript, it sounds like a cough syrup, or when chamomile tea was used, it gets really close to a 16th century hot toddy that you would drink for like an upper respiratory infection or something. And these references from Shakespeare seem to suggest Metheglin was also recreational. So tell us about Metheglin. How was it different from some of these other drinks that we're talking about? And was it a medicine?
Yes. Maybe no.
Well, I'm just so we can be clear.
Of course. So now we get into another slightly convoluted answer. Metheglin is a really interesting study because, in large part, because there's a lot of questions I still don't have answers for. And I'm looking for them, but I don't speak Welsh and I'm not in Wales. And that makes some of this a little hard. So I've already given some of it away. The first we see of Metheglin in English is about the year 1400, where a number of recipes appear in multiple manuscripts. They're very complex recipes and fully formed, so they don't seem like they're newly created, and they all point back to Wales. The drink is sometimes called other things like precious drink, or in one case, potus merlinus, or the drink of Merlin, with an interesting sort of mystical attribution. In these cases, it always contains dozens of herbs and sometimes spices, uses quite a bit of honey, and sometimes is made in quite large amounts, 100 gallons or more. The word metheglin in Welsh, meth, mead. Oh, you think you got it? No. In Welsh, it literally means medicinal drink. And the one recipe I know of from before that 1400 time period in Welsh is not a mead. It is a medicinal drink, but it contains no honey. So I have this sort of abrupt stop at this transition between Welsh and English that I don't know where it goes, and I'm getting at it might be a little bit difficult. So through the 1400s, metheglin is very much a medicinal drink. So why we have to explain the interaction between medicine and food and drink. In the 16th century, medicine was still dominated by a then 2,000-year-old concept of medicine called humoral theory. It's this idea that the entirety of creation, including the human body and its health, is governed by hot and dry, cold and wet, and everything partakes of these characteristics, including a human. If you are a hot and wet complexion or humor, you are sanguine, which is associated with blood. Again, if you're wet and cold, you're phlegmatic, and that's associated with phlegm. We also have choleric and melancholic people. So the entirety of food and medicine has this subtext to it of balancing those humors so you are in balance and your life is good and you are healthy. And this is done both through food and drink and through your medicine. So metheglin was hot and dry, and you would add hot and dry herbs to it, and it would be medicinal, and it would help you in that way. So by Shakespeare's lifetime, this metheglin was in the middle of a transformation. Language changes, and it changes all the time. And when you're looking at a drink with 9,000 years of history, should we be at all surprised that those words and the meanings of those words changes? And so did metheglin. It starts becoming recreational. First, we see people adding spices, which I think was an effort to make it taste a little better. 60 herbs and spices. Oh, well, that's a little bit better. So the number of herbs goes down. There are spices, and the context in which the recipes are presented begins to be more recreational than medicinal. This is associated with the changes that were taking back then. Science was beginning to be a thing, observation, the world around you, alchemy, which today we think of as purely a mystical thing, but then was chemistry at its core. Classical thought begins to be replaced by the scientific method and real investigation of the world around us. So I think in the context, Shakespeare is speaking of Metheglin in its new recreational manifestation. And then by the early 17th century, Metheglin in England became a term that essentially meant mead. And it kept that meaning for several hundred years afterwards.
There are 3 different meads that come up in Laura's publication on 15th century meads, including Metheglin, but also Melomel and Hydromel. I hope I'm saying those correctly. Laura, what are the differences between these types of mead?
So this gets right back to that naming we were talking about. If you asked a modern mead maker today what these meant, they would have a very simple and straightforward answer. And as a mead historian, I would go, no, that's really not quite it. You're historically, maybe today that's great. We've redefined the words. That's what they mean now. But historically, that's not really the whole story. So we see Melomel is a great example. Today's mead maker would look and say, oh, that's a mead made with fruits, cherries, blueberries, plums. We have separate names for ones made with grapes and ones made with apples, but they could also be called melomels as well. So here, if you went to someone 400 or 500 years ago who was an educated person, they would know that the Latin melomel is mallow or mellow for quinces and mel for honey. Literally, it's quinces preserved in honey, and you can find recipes to make quinces preserved in honey because you don't want the fruit to rot over time. Now, interestingly enough, we can add to this another twist because language is never clear, is there is confusion in early Latin between mallow quinces and mala apples, which are also very close fruits. So we can sometimes say, well, is this quinces or apple? Which gets interesting when you're trying to recreate the drink. So then we put that water-laden fruit into honey. It dilutes the honey and allows for fermentation. One of the fun things about honey is honey with so much sugar in it is essentially never rots. It just sits there forever and ever and ever. I think people have found hundreds and even 1,000-year-old honey that's still pretty much recognizable as honey. I'm not sure I'd eat it. I have a jar in our basement that's now about 30 years old, and now it's to the point where I have to find something really good to do with it. But it could sit for another 10 years and it will have changes. There's chemistry going on, but it's still honey pretty much. So if we look at these old recipes in these old texts, some of them continue on from them and say, after it sat for about a year, you can drink it by itself. This very sweet, still very thick and syrupy, but slightly fermented with those wild organisms. Or some of them say, why not add 3 parts of water to 1 part of this and then make a mead? And so you're making this mead from this already fermented honey, which has these complex flavors going on. And it's really wild. It's wonderful. It's complex. It's unpredictable. And I have a couple of batches of honey that have been sitting downstairs for longer than I want to admit that are waiting to make another batch. So Melomel, as far as I can tell, was sometime in the 1970s redefined by someone in the modern world looking for this generic Latin, cool, historical sounding word to talk about meads made with fruits. I don't know who, when, where, or why, but maybe someday I'll figure it out.
What would they say then about hydromels?
So hydromel is actually, thank goodness, a little simpler than either melomel or metheglin. Hydromel is another word that we can figure out from the Latin very easily. hydro, water, mel, honey, honey, water, mead. And in fact, it does have a very general meaning of mead, but in context, we can look at it and find some nuances to it, which are helpful. In the modern world, hydromel has been defined as a relatively low alcohol mead between about 3.5% and 7.5% alcohol by volume. In the medieval and early modern words, hydromel was more often used to describe a relatively low alcohol mead, again, that was usually used in a medicinal context, most often as a substrate into which you'd mix herbs and extract their medicinal properties and then squeeze that out and drink that as the medicine. So in Shakespeare's time, to Shakespeare, hydromel is either likely to have either been mead in general or potentially that more medicinal version, which was used to deliver medications.
One recipe Laura's work highlights as she describes it as containing the earliest known use in mead of an egg as a method to measure specific gravity or sugar content. Laura, we're all newbies here to making mead, so tell us about specific gravity and what that even means, and why the use of an egg in this recipe was surprising to discover.
So this is where nerds like me just get absolutely happy. This whole process of understanding what a recipe meant, trying to figure out what it called for, so we can try to make something that approaches a mead that Shakespeare could have drunk. And this requires, again, looking at things broadly and then narrowing down and looking at options. And it's all very sciencey. And well, as someone who is trained as an engineer, it's kind of what I like to do. So we look at it, we figure it out, and we try to make it. That process is something that is getting more and more popular. It's called experimental archaeology. We figure out how things work by trying to do them, which sometimes works great and other times not so well. So eggs and meat, not in your final mead, although eggs are used in mead mostly to clarify it, which is another option. But here, you take a whole egg, you drop it in your mixture and see whether it sinks or floats. Why? Well, an important part of making mead is understanding how much sugar you really have there, because how much sugar, how much alcohol. Your fermenting organism can only produce so much alcohol. So if you put in way too much sugar, it will chew through as much as it can, stop because it's no longer a happy environment, and leave a lot of sugar left. That's what you want, that's great. If it's not what you want, you're less happy. So we're trying to figure out how much sugar is really in there in a time before modern instrumentation. Honey weighs about 12 pounds per gallon. Water only weighs a bit over 8 pounds per gallon. So if we add a bunch of honey to a bunch of water and then measure what the weight per gallon of that is, we get a fairly accurate measure of how much sugar is in it. And that helps drive our process and drive our ability to control our product. This number is a ratio. So if I say I add 12 pounds of honey to 8 pounds of water and I end up with 2 gallons, 1 gallon of each of 20 pounds, I have 10 pounds, it weighs 10 pounds. And that difference, 1.25 times the weight of the water, is a number that tells us, and it's called density or specific gravity. And brewers use this to help control their process. I promise that's all for the math. I'm done with the math, really.
You wouldn't think you'd get into math on a Shakespeare podcast, but look at that. Math is everywhere.
Math is everywhere. I do try to be very cognizant that it comes trippingly off my tongue because that's what I do. So these days we use a simple instrument to do that called a hydrometer. Again, that Latin, hydro, water, meter. But that didn't exist until the late 17th century. But here you have an egg. And interestingly enough, the density of an egg is sort of right in the middle of that range where we're going to make a pretty good mead. So I started looking into this, and it looked into it from two directions. First, how dense is an egg? And now a lot of people know that as eggs get older, air comes in through the shell and the egg gets less dense, which is the origin of the put an egg in water and if it floats, it's bad. You may have heard of that.
I have heard of that. I tried that with my chicken's egg. It does work for fresh eggs.
Yes. So almost all of the things ask for a fresh hen's egg before that changes started taking place. I have a neighbor who keeps hens, and they like to keep hens of multiple different species. So they were kind enough to give me a dozen eggs from 4 different species. Some were white, some were brown, one was even green. Really pretty eggs. First, I did this, and the range of the densities was way broader than I expected. So putting on my science hat, I went to literature and ended up neck deep in how to raise modern hens for egg production. Wouldn't have thought that had to do with Shakespeare either, did you?
We're learning so much right now.
Well, as it turns out, everything is connected, and it does have to do with Shakespeare, because the density of a hen's egg is not particularly a tight range. In fact, the range of typical densities of fresh hen's eggs covers really lot of the range of gravities that will make meads. So no, it's not really a particularly good measure of exactly where your mead is, but it is a good measure of whether or not you're going to make a decent mead.
So there's a correlation between the density of the eggs. And I guess that makes sense to me, because if you think about dropping an egg in a glass of water versus dropping an egg in a glass of honey, obviously it's going to not be able to fall through straight honey. So you can see that's a nice visual for those who may not be math centric, to picture in your mind how an egg could be an indicator for how much the sugar content is. Somewhere between water and a straight jar of honey, the egg is going to be able to give you that indication. And I don't often have the opportunity to tell my listeners this, but I actually do have a background in math. I used to teach math, and both of my parents are electrical engineers. So I'm very familiar with how you can find math anywhere. So it's very fitting to be able to show that this shows up when you're raising chickens or making mead.
And you're right, because there's a well over half of the range between the pure water and the pure honey is not at all suitable for making mead. So the fact that even though it's very broad, where those hen's eggs are going to lead you is all within that range of potentially good mead is a huge help. Or if you're starting with, let's not waste anything. You have all those honeycombs, and even after you've squeezed out all the honey, there's still a sticky mess with lots of honey left in them. And there was a lot of, and it was admittedly viewed as lower class mead. You take that, you wash it with water, and then you boil it until it's thick enough to make mead. How do you know? You measure it with the egg. And we do see those eggs appearing in other things. A fellow named Bartholomeus Anglicus in about 1240 wrote an Encyclopedia of the World. And in this, he says, an egg will float on seawater, which, as it turns out, actually isn't true. But it is an even earlier use of an egg to measure that kind of density. And we also see floating eggs used in soap making to measure the concentration of the lye solution that makes soap.
Well, we've referred to several medicinal uses of mead here, but I wonder what kind of ailments they were used to treat. What did someone pull mead off the shelf for if you were sick?
All sorts of things, sometimes contradictory, but it turns out mead is really good for all kinds of ailments, either all by itself as a plain mead or with other things mixed in that have their own medicinal properties. I'm going to refer here because I was just translating it the other day. A French doctor, Jean de Renou, wrote in 1608, in the summer season, and for young people, the most watery is prescribed. In winter, and for the old, And for those who are phlegmatic, there's those humors again, the wine-like or honey-like. But before I go further, and I will go a little further, I need to give that obligatory disclaimer that some of these recipes will make things that are not actually particularly healthy, and some of them are actively dangerous. Some of these herbs are not safe for general consumption. So a doctor from Shakespeare's time would tell you that mead, because of its heat and dryness, is good for all older people. And if you want to just buy that in the modern day, remember old then was much younger than old now, because it replaces the heat that they are typically lacking because they just can't generate that internal heat that you can when you're young. And that's something you see in Shakespeare's plays a lot, isn't it? The internal heat of the young. So it's also good for people who can't drink wine for some reason, or for those who live in cold climates. So we see, and I'm going to go through a list here of some of the fun things. General application against problems in the lungs, chest, stomach. Specific English recipes from the 15th and 16th century include ones to heat headache, internal bleeding, and against stones. You will be pleased to know, if you should encounter this in your modern day, that it aids in the production of urine always. A 1582 recipe includes an ingredient called lignum sanctum, or holy wood. This is given as a cure for syphilis, which at the time was a relatively new illness that was epidemic, disfiguring, and inevitably fatal. So you can see why they would be very interested in something they thought would cure it. My experience is with a 1599 recipe that's supposed to be for pain in the joints. It uses nutmeg, cinnamon, and sage. There's your savory mixed with your spices. Unfortunately, despite multiple doses, I did not find any notable improvement in my joints. But I keep drinking it because it's tasty.
So don't go reaching for a nice mead to cure your rheumatoid arthritis, but it will apparently make you have to go to the bathroom.
Sure. And keep you warm in the winter.
And keep you warm in the winter. Absolutely. Not to mention be fun and tasty to share with all your friends.
There you go.
Now, one of the recipes that Laura mentions in her manuscript uses the instruction, boil a mile away. Now, Laura, I was really surprised by this because I have no idea what that means. Are they suggesting that you should be a mile away from your boiling pot, or is that referring to something else?
This is, again, part of the fun to me of figuring this all out, because if I want to make this mead, I have to figure out exactly, and the longer you boil it, the more water you drive out and the more sugar you have in it. So it does actually make a significant difference in how it's going to taste in the end. So you think about it. And this one I think is pretty straightforward. When we talk about boiling something, we usually talk about time. Okay, so how do you convert a mile away into time? To me, the obvious interpretation is the time it takes to walk a mile. Or is it a mile and back? Because that's the difference between about maybe 20 minutes and 40 minutes. And I think we could equally argue for either one of those. But we can try, although I'm willing to bet that just like the egg, the difference between 20 and 40 minutes is going to be a bit of a difference, but not a humongous difference. And this is one of the things I sometimes use when I'm recreating a recipe to tweak it towards the direction that my modern knowledge tells me is going to be tastier for my intents. Although when I do that, I usually try to admit that that's the reason rather than pretending that I have some great historical justification why that's the correct answer.
At this point, Laura, I think we're both intrigued and excited to try and create a mead for ourselves, as well as mildly terrified that we might poison ourselves. So please set us on the straight and narrow here. If we wanted to create a mead like what would have been in existing for Shakespeare's lifetime, tell us what the process might be like and what ingredients should we use?
So the first, to allay the fears, is one, there's a lot of information out there on how to do this well. And two, most of the things that are going to cause something that is not particularly healthy in fermentation are pretty darn obvious when you're doing them. If there's mold on it, do not drink it. If it smells like rotten eggs, you probably want to say that was a learning experience. So don't get too paranoid. Remember, people have been doing this for almost 10,000 years. It can't be that hard. So here's where we get this conflict between being a mead maker and being a historian. Those just starting out, I think, should really first learn how to make mead and go to some modern instructions, understand the modern considerations, and make sure you're learning that enough of the chemistry and enough of the safety that you're not taking unwarranted risks. Once you understand that, you have to figure out what you're trying to achieve. That's always the question I ask. Whether it's a person who just wants to make mead or someone who wants to, what are you trying to achieve? Is there something you particularly want to understand? Do you want to pursue ultimate of historical accuracy in ingredients, materials, and methods? That's probably pretty close to impossible, but if you want to do it, it's a great thing to try. Or do you want to make something that has a historical connection for your own use? Does that historical connection want to be small or large? There are no right and wrong answers here, although I always feel like I have to say, but please don't lie to yourself about what you're doing. If it's not historical, say, yep, I chose this for this reason. Have a nice life. So
it's okay to have fun with it, as long as you are acknowledging that you're conducting a giant experiment.
Well, but the process of experimentation is going to be at the core of anything you're trying to do historically. There's always something new to figure out what it means and how it works.
One of the best places to start if you are wanting to dive into the history of mead and explore this is Laura's website. Laura has recreated mead and studied the history and science of this for decades, and you can check out mysteryofmead.com to check out what she has done. And it's just a great starting point if you want to know more about Metheglin and Melomel and the history of mead and all these honey wine beverages that we've been talking about today. So I definitely suggest that you start there to explore this history and even find out more about how you could make this for yourself. We'll have a link to that website in the show notes for today's episode. Now, Laura, pulling from your vast experience in this area of history, I know that you will be able to share with us some good starting points if we're new to this part of history and we want to learn more. In addition to your own website, what should we explore to learn more?
Well, if you're looking at making mead and making historical mead, your best thing to do is to start with a recipe. So where do I find a recipe? The internet. Oh my goodness, the internet is an amazing place. Don't we all know that? It's also one where you have to have a healthy dose of suspicion and caution. So after 30 years of doing this, I'm amazed at how much there still is to learn. But that doesn't mean it's a huge barrier to entry. So I'm going to recommend the Folger Shakespeare Library. Why? Not because of Shakespeare, although that has have a lot to do with it, but because they have a fairly extensive collection of recipe books. And not only do they have those recipe books, but they have digitized and put online close to 100 of them. And the majority of those have been transcribed already with those files available with word search capability. Yay!
Yay!
My catalog contains almost 200 recipes for mead from the Folger Shakespeare Library books. And I'm hoping that'll top 200 when I manage to make a week to go down to Washington, D.C. and rummage through their ones that aren't digitized yet. I've got a list of probably 20 or 30 cookbooks that they haven't digitized yet that I'm interested in.
I will second the Folger. They have a wonderful resource collection there. And yes, we'll place links to the Folger in the show notes as well, because it's just, and you can just go down all kinds of rabbit holes and stay there and research forever. They have all kinds of great things.
But anyone who tells me they can't find a starting point in 100 recipe books is looking for something I'm not quite sure what. There's also a lot of other places you can look. another library that has an even bigger collection of recipe books, again, most of which are online and digitized, but unfortunately, in this case, very few of them have been transcribed, is the Wellcome Library in London. That's Wellcome with two L's, which is actually a medical history library. But after what we talked about earlier, will it come to anyone's surprise that medicine and cooking are really very interrelated? You can also look at, do a lot of the online book resources, but again, now you're limiting yourself to books, not manuscripts, have very robust internal search word capability. They tend to be literal, so you have to search on Mead, M-E-A-D, Mead, M-E-D-E, et cetera, but all Google Books, Internet Archive, Hathi Trust, Biodiversity Library are all places I regularly use. Because most of what we're looking at when we're looking pre-17th century, even 18th century, it's all public domain. And the proportion of books scanned is very high. If you're looking for manuscripts, again, start with the big national libraries. British Library, Bibliothèque Nationale Française in Paris, Bergische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, actually, and the Vatican libraries as well, all have a lot of stuff that's digitized and online, although searching becomes a lot harder because the catalog entries are not typical to say, oh, and by the way, there's meat recipes here. And just as a side note, I was happily, I don't know if this has come up in your talks, but the British Library website was essentially destroyed in October of 2023 by a cyber attack. Are you aware of that?
We had heard about this. Yes, it was a huge, huge disruption.
Yes.
In fact, disruption, I think, is mild.
Disruption, basically, their website disappeared overnight, which confused the heck out of me for a while. They have now set a date that the first almost 1,000 digitized manuscripts from their collection will be back online September 30th, 2024. And we are very happy. And I am waiting, taking bets for anyone who wants to, how long it will take. Will it be 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, until I find something in those manuscripts that really, really, really should have been in the English Mead history book I published earlier this spring.
Laura has sent over a list of prints, web articles to things like the American Homebrewers Association and some groups on Facebook for modern mead makers, and even some YouTube channels that you can check out, like City Studying Brews and Man-Made Mead. You can check out these to explore more. And we'll have links to all of these in the show notes for today's episode, along with links to these libraries where you can look up the historical recipes for mead and find your own that you might like to make at home. Now, Laura, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Read this question, and I thought it was going to be hard, but it wasn't. It was deathly easy. My compact Oxford English Dictionary with the magnifying glass, please. And I hope I will be allowed, the fact that the magnifying glass will also allow me to start a fire easily.
To start a fire. Yes, that's brilliant. What a good selection. And once you get rescued from your deserted island, we can check back in with you on the etymology of mead versus meadows. And maybe the deserted island time would have yielded some clarity there. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Yeah, everything. Rabbit hole galore. I love my rabbit holes and often get teased about it in my family. So as I mentioned earlier this spring, I published a book on the history of mead in Great Britain. And that was quite I tried to make it very scholarly, as it were. And I think I succeeded. And it's really I think it's got a lot of fun stuff in it. So after that, I'm working on a bunch of new things. One of the big parts of this is actually going over all those. I have in my files, when I find something interesting but don't have time to deal with it, I write need to review and highlight it in blue so I can find it again. And there's lots of blue all over everything. It's an eternal, but I have 2 books that are coming up. I don't know which one's going to be first. It's going to work out as I get there. The first of these is a deep dive into the over 100 titled mead recipes present in a 1669 book called The Closet of the Eminent Sir Kenelm Digby Opened. And this is really one of the largest collections of mead recipes ever published. And I want to look at the ingredients, how they're made, how many of them include floating an egg, which is about half of them, and all the context, what the ingredients are, what that means, and how mead developed in the 17th century. Things like that. Is Metheglin medicinal, or is it a recreational drink? So that's going to be a lot about context and also how we interpret recipes. The second is something that's aimed at another topic we talked about a little bit today. Is there's all this interest in mead and historical drinks and different kinds of drinks. Cocktails are becoming popular again. Home brewing is fairly popular. So the second is just going to be a representative selection of recipes for various drinks that are from medieval primary sources. No, well, this is based on well, the ingredients may have been put together. No, this is what they wrote. So what we can be fairly certain they actually at least thought about doing, even if in some cases we aren't sure they actually did it. I'm aiming for about 500 recipes, and I'll cover wine, beer, mead, cider, a spiced drink, spiced and sweetened wine, which is usually called hippocras or claret, and whatever else I run across in the process. So that, and in my copious spare time, I try to write things and talk to people like you and converse with various people who are researching similar and sometimes not entirely dissimilar topics. From people I've written me and I've just started to talk to, I've learned all about 19th century shakers making mead in New England. A lot about different kinds of honey in ancient Greece, honey prices in medieval England, all sorts of topics.
Well, Laura, I know I am thrilled to see your next books come out, and it's just a race to the finish for which one will make it to the finish line first, but I know they will both be fantastic, and I can't wait to see them come to life. Thank you, Laura Angotti, for being here this week and taking us through the history of meads for Shakespeare's lifetime and inspiring and encouraging us to be able to recreate them for ourselves. It's been a fun conversation, and I thank you so much for being here today to share this history with us. The list of websites and resources and libraries that Laura mentions today are all included in the regular show notes for today's episode. You can find these listed along with this episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 347. That's CassidyCash.com/EP347. If you would like to try your hand at making mead along with me, you can sign up with our Shakespeare Educator tier on Patreon. I will be making mead live with our Shakespeare educators and walking you through how you can cook up your own 16th century recipe right along with me, as well as access the full printable activity kit for making mead that includes a video tutorial, step-by-step instructions, and a printable supply list that lets you explore more history and take this activity into your home or classroom. We'll be making 3 different kinds of mead to satisfy all different tastes, whether you like sweet or savory. And of course, we'll be trying Laura's favorite mead, the lemon and rosemary. So if you'd like to come along with us as we make this in the Shakespeare Educator Library, then join us as a Shakespeare Educator right now at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. All the details and information for how to sign up are right there on Patreon. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.